Picture a world at war, where distant generals sit in candlelit bunkers, puffing smoke into maps of conquest, their laughter cutting through the dim air. They mocked what they thought was America's greatest weakness, a nation too indulgent, too domestic, where women busied themselves with kitchens and sewing machines. German officers traded jokes that American women could never build a rifle straight, let alone an aircraft or a tank. To them, the United States was a land of plenty but not of discipline, a nation that would collapse if men left the factories for the front lines. Yet, across the ocean, under the glow of factory lights that burned through the night, a different story was being written, one rivet at a time. The image is almost cinematic. Imagine a cold winter morning in 1942, steam rising from the chimneys of Detroit as the clatter of machinery drowns out the city's heartbeat. Inside, a young woman in overalls ties back her hair, grips a rivet gun with blistered hands, and drills steel into the wing of a bomber that will soon cross the Atlantic. She is not alone. By the thousands, women streamed into plants once closed to them, some leaving farmhouses, others leaving classrooms, carrying with them determination rather than fear. German generals may have laughed, but the thunder of American women's labor was already echoing across the oceans. The contradiction is brutal in Europe. Women were expected to remain shadows behind curtains, stitching uniforms or scavenging scraps. In America, they stood on platforms above roaring furnaces, their faces marked by soot, their bodies aching but unbroken. Even the newspapers captured this shift with slogans and images that the Reich dismissed as propaganda. But the laughter of German officers would soon give way to shock when statistics and steel proved that those weak women were building the machines of their defeat. And so the stage was set. What began as derision in distant barracks would end in silent awe, as Rosie the Riveter and millions like her outbuilt the Reich, one relentless shift at a time. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And as we begin this journey, share your location and your local time in the comments below, somewhere. A factory whistle once blew at this very hour, and its echo still carries across history. The thunder of the arsenal of democracy was not born in silence. It came alive in the clang of hammers, the hiss of welding torches, and the endless roar of conveyor belts that seemed to stretch to the horizon. What Germany's generals could not imagine was that America's factories, once geared to automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines, could pivot overnight to the mass production of weapons. Yet in 1942 and 1943, Detroit, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Buffalo became more than cities. They were battlefields of iron and sweat, where millions of women became soldiers without rifles. By day and by night, they worked beneath the relentless hum of floodlights. Rows of women in bandanas and safety goggles stood at machines once thought too complex for them. In a California shipyard, two sisters from Oklahoma competed to see who could weld faster, their rivalry producing destroyers ahead of schedule. In Pennsylvania, an entire group of seamstresses, once sewing dresses, were retrained to stitch parachutes, their delicate precision now saving pilots in the skies. Every story was a thread in the larger fabric of production. The gossip of the factory floor traveled as quickly as the assembly line itself. A woman in Cleveland joked that she could build a bomber before she learned to drive a car, and she wasn't far off. In Michigan, cafeteria workers who once served soup to schoolchildren now spooned out beans and black coffee to welders whose break lasted no longer than the time it took to swallow. These details, the cheap sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, the scalding thermoses filled at dawn, revealed a workforce that was both ordinary and extraordinary. And still, the numbers mounted. Ford's Willow Run plant turned out B-24 bombers at a pace once thought impossible, one plane every 63 minutes. Kaiser's shipyards produced Liberty ships so quickly that the record fell to just 4 days from keel to launch. German intelligence dismissed these reports as fantasy, convinced that no workforce led by women could sustain such output. But the Reich's disbelief only deepened the eventual shock. At night, when the shifts ended, rivers of women in grease-stained overalls poured out of the factory gates, their boots striking the pavement in unison. Some walked home past flickering neon signs. Others boarded crowded buses that reeked of sweat and iron filings. The streets themselves became symbols of transformation once quiet. now alive with the rhythm of war. The laughter of German generals was fading, drowned beneath the industrial symphony that spanned a continent. While men bled on the front lines, women turned America into a machine of war. A machine so vast, it could not be imagined in Berlin's dimly lit bunkers. The arsenal had awakened, and it would not be silenced. The most staggering weapon America wielded was not the bomber or the tank, but the numbers themselves. Statistics became artillery, each figure a shell exploding against the fragile assumptions of the Reich. In the early years of the war, German analysts estimated that the United States could at best contribute a trickle of material support while fighting Japan. By 1943, those reports looked like cruel jokes, buried under the avalanche of production that women had made possible. Consider the scale. By the war's end, American factories had produced over 300,000 aircraft, more than 80,000 tanks, and nearly 2.5 million trucks. These numbers were not abstract, they were lifelines on battlefields. Entire armies rolled forward on rubber tires, on engines assembled by hands that had once folded laundry or cleaned houses. Ford's Willow Run plant, powered by women's labor, churned out planes faster than Germany could shoot them down. Each B-24 was a floating fortress of aluminum and steel, riveted together by workers whose names never appeared in newspapers, but whose fingerprints, quite literally, held the wings in place. The gossip from inside those plants was often as revealing as any statistic. In Seattle, a foreman complained that women workers slowed down production with chatter, only to admit in his own diary that their laughter kept the night shift alive. In another account, a young riveter confessed in a letter home that she sometimes forgot what day it was. Her entire life reduced to the endless cycle of clanging metal and the shrill whistle that dictated her existence. These were not faceless cogs, but people carrying the burden of history on shoulders that had never been asked to before. The German generals who once laughed began to hear rumors filtering through prisoner interrogations and censored newspapers. They scoffed when told that American shipyards had produced more tonnage in a single year than the entire Kriegsmarine had floated in a decade. Yet the truth was undeniable: whole fleets of Liberty ships, some built in less than a week, carried supplies across the Atlantic. Tanks poured from assembly lines in such quantities that even Soviet commanders marveled, calling America the warehouse of the world. It was a rhythm almost unnatural. Conveyor belts never stopped, lights never dimmed, and the noise of factories became the lullaby of a nation. The Reich had gambled on a short war, assuming that America would falter under the strain of distance and divided attention. But instead, women on the home front transformed production into a form of combat every bit as decisive as any battle fought with guns. As 1943 turned into 1944, German officers in Europe began to see with their own eyes the scale of this industrial miracle. The jeeps, the planes, the endless columns of trucks, they were not the products of laughter, but of resolve. Numbers had become weapons, and the Reich was already outnumbered beyond repair. In the dim barracks of POW camps scattered across America, German officers and generals sat hunched over tables, their boots scuffing wooden floors, voices low but tense. What had once been laughter now became murmurs. Gossip carried from guard to prisoner, from newspapers smuggled in or read aloud by those who could manage English. The name that echoed again and again was Rosie the Riveter. To the Reich, she had been little more than a cartoon, a piece of propaganda to rally soft civilians. Yet in the stillness of confinement, they saw photographs, clippings, and magazines that painted a different picture. Women with rolled-up sleeves and oil-streaked cheeks leaned against bombers and tanks, their smiles both weary and defiant. Some generals dismissed it at first. One scoffed that America staged the images, insisting that women could never master precision tools. Another, flipping through a copy of Life magazine, fell into silence at the sight of a production chart showing output measured not in dozens, but in tens of thousands. The gossip in the barracks shifted tone. A younger officer recalled how, in Berlin, he had once joked about American women being too fragile to lift a hammer. Now he admitted, in a whisper to his bunkmate, that the fragile ones were building fleets larger than the Reich's imagination. Daily camp life sharpened these realizations. Some POWs were sent on labor details near canning factories or lumber mills. They saw women driving forklifts, women managing ledgers, women directing whole teams of men without hesitation. One captured general writing secretly in a confiscated notebook. Noted his astonishment at seeing black and white women working side by side, something unthinkable in the racial hierarchies of Nazi ideology. The laughter that had once mocked this possibility now seemed grotesque, out of place, even shameful. Tensions grew within the prisoner ranks. Arguments broke out in hushed tones after lights out, some clinging desperately to the myth of German superiority, others shaken to their core by the evidence surrounding them. A POW remembered being shown a photograph of the Willow Run bomber plant, its ceiling stretching like a cathedral over a sea of machinery. He muttered to himself, "This is not propaganda. This is a world we never imagined." The silence of these barracks became heavier than any laughter could ever have been. Behind the barbed wire, with nowhere to run, the German officers were forced to confront the collapse of certainty. Their ideology, their arrogance, even their sense of manhood seemed hollow compared to the steel reality being forged in American factories. The newspapers might have called it Rosie, but to these prisoners, it was something else entirely, the sound of inevitability. Built by hands they had dismissed, now hammering the coffin of their Reich, beyond statistics and clippings. The story of America's wartime factories was written in the quiet, human details that no general could predict. Each rivet gun and welding torch had behind it a person with a family, a life, a dream that did not pause for war. Mothers left children asleep under quilts to walk through pre-dawn darkness toward factory gates. Teenagers, some barely 18, tied up their hair and pulled on heavy gloves, learning overnight the skills that had once taken apprentices years to master. Factories did not erase their humanity, they magnified it, adding grit to everyday survival. The scale of labor was astonishing, but what gave it force were the small sacrifices. A lunch pail filled with hastily packed bread and apples became as symbolic as any weapon. A worker's shoes wore thin from double shifts, yet she pressed on, stitching parachutes or checking wiring. Gossip at break tables revolved not around idle chatter, but around shortages who had managed to buy sugar, who had stood for hours in ration lines. A woman in Pittsburgh was teased for sewing her own coveralls from her husband's old uniform. Another in Portland showed up with powder burns across her hands, earning her the nickname Iron Mary. These details never reached headlines, but they carried the true texture of history. The fatigue was real. Some fainted at machines, others developed coughs from inhaling fumes, but each story added weight to the arsenal's momentum. The rhythm of war production had its human toll. Yet workers persisted. A riveter once remarked to a camp interviewer that she thought of every bolt as a promise to her brother fighting overseas. That single sentence captured the essence of the entire mobilization. Each machine was not just steel, but a thread of connection to loved ones at the front. What German generals could not fathom was that this scale of production came not from fear, but from community and determination. Entire neighborhoods shifted their rhythms to factory whistles. Children learned to fall asleep to the sound of train horns carrying tanks westward. Pastors adjusted Sunday services around rotating shifts, reminding congregants that their labor was as sacred as prayer. Here lies a question for you. The audience, if you had lived in that time, would you have stepped into the factory, sacrificing rest, comfort, and family time for the sake of something larger? Would you have endured 12-hour nights, soot-streaked faces, and hands blistered raw, knowing each day built another step toward victory? Share your thoughts below. I wonder how many of us today could shoulder what they once carried. The factories were machines, but the people were the pulse. Without their ordinary struggles and extraordinary resilience, numbers would have been meaningless. The arsenal of democracy was not faceless steel, it was human endurance, hammered into shape. For German prisoners sent to work details near American industrial centers, the revelation came not in numbers on paper, but in the living scenes they could not unsee. They watched trains thunder past, carrying endless cargo, each boxcar stenciled with the stamp of another factory. They glimpsed assembly yards where women in headscarves climbed scaffolding like ants upon colossi of steel. For men, raised in a world where war was the province of soldiers and industry, the domain of men. These sights cut deeper than any propaganda leaflet ever could. One diary entry from a former Africa Corps officer described his shock at seeing women directing men with authority in a Kansas aircraft plant. He admitted to staring at a black woman calmly instructing two white mechanics, her voice clear over the din, her clipboard steady as she ticked off each task. To him, raised in the suffocating hierarchies of Nazi ideology, it was like glimpsing another planet. That day, he stopped laughing. The gossip inside POW camps became less boastful, more unsettled. Some men mocked the spectacle as a temporary aberration, insisting America would collapse from exhaustion. Others argued that the evidence was overwhelming that a society able to marshal women and men together, across color lines and class, held a power no battlefield victory could erase. One officer recalled the shame he felt when shown photographs of tanks being tested by female drivers. Mud splattering across their faces as they gripped the controls with steady hands. He muttered to himself that the Reich had underestimated not America, but women. Ordinary encounters struck deepest. A guard once offered a POW part of his wife's lunch, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, with a neatly cut apple. The prisoner marveled that even in wartime scarcity, an American family had food simple yet plentiful, produced while the mother of the household worked 12-hour shifts. Another time, POWs passing by a factory fence watched as workers poured out at midnight, thousands of women spilling onto the street, their boots clattering in unison. The sight silenced the men for days. And now I must ask you, the audience, if you had been one of those prisoners, standing behind the barbed wire, watching an industrial miracle built by the very people you once scorned, what would you have felt? Awe, envy, humiliation, or perhaps something deeper? A recognition that the world you thought immutable was crumbling before your eyes. Leave your reflections in the comments. Your perspective adds to the history we keep alive here, for the generals and officers. Realization came not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow corrosion of certainty. Each whistle, each rumble of machinery carried through the night, stripped away another layer of arrogance. They had laughed at women, but the echo that returned to them was the sound of an empire outbuilt, outproduced, and outlasted. By 1944 and 1945, as the Reich staggered under the weight of Allied advances, the full truth could no longer be denied. The German war machine, once touted as invincible, was dwarfed by an American arsenal that seemed endless. But behind every tank, bomber, and jeep that rolled across Europe was the invisible imprint of women's labor. The laughter of German generals had long since died, replaced by the silence of recognition. Inside POW camps, some prisoners began to speak in hushed tones about what this meant for the future. A colonel confided to a fellow inmate that defeat was inevitable, not because of any single battle, but because America had mobilized half its population in a way the Reich had never dared. He compared it to a tide, relentless, rising, impossible to turn back. Another prisoner, staring at a photograph of Rosie the Riveter pinned to a bulletin board, muttered that he had underestimated not just America, but the resilience of women everywhere. Back home, the gossip of factory life continued. A riveter in Los Angeles joked that she had built so many wings she dreamed of them at night, the pounding of rivet guns echoing in her sleep. A cafeteria worker in Chicago confided to a friend that she sometimes slipped an extra scoop of potatoes to the youngest welders. Knowing they had left children at home, these fragments of daily life formed the heartbeat of an industrial miracle that reshaped the 20th century. Numbers still told the larger story. By the end of the war, American factories had delivered more war material than Germany and Japan combined could ever hope to match. Aircraft swarmed skies in formations too vast to count. Convoys of Liberty ships carried supplies across oceans faster than U-boats could sink them. The Reich collapsed not only from Allied firepower, but from exhaustion, from the realization that its enemy's strength came from sources it had mocked into oblivion. The symbolic image is stark barbed wire, silhouetted against a horizon lit, not by gunfire, but by the glow of factory lights. Behind those wires, prisoners wrestled with the collapse of their certainties. Beyond them, women punched time cards, lifted tools, and pressed forward without pause. What had begun as derision had become surrender, not just of armies in the field, but of an entire worldview that had failed to imagine the power of women in overalls. The laughter of German generals had been swallowed by history, replaced by the hammering rhythm of America's women. And in that rhythm, the Reich was buried, When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world looked upon a landscape reshaped not only by armies and generals, but by the quiet determination of millions whose names were never recorded in history books. Among them were women in overalls, their hair tied back, their hands scarred by tools, their eyes weary from shifts that blurred day into night. They had not asked to become symbols. Yet they became the pulse of a nation at war. For the German prisoners who once laughed, the memory of those factories lingered long after barbed wire had rusted away. Some would later write of the shock they felt at the sight of women commanding production floors, of assembly lines that never slept, of cities aglow even in wartime blackout for them. The sound of rivet guns and conveyor belts became a haunting echo, proof that the world they had known was already gone. History often measures wars in battles and treaties, but the deeper truth lies in moments too ordinary to seem historic at the time a lunchbox packed before dawn. A whispered goodnight to a child before heading to the plant. A soldier staring in disbelief at a newspaper photograph of Rosie the Riveter. These fragments are what transform numbers into meaning, what turns statistics into stories that still breathe decades later. Perhaps that is why memory matters. To remember these women is to remember that power is not always found in cannons or strategies, but in persistence, in hands blistered from labor, in courage expressed through endurance. The factories fell quiet after the war. The whistles faded, the floodlights dimmed, but the legacy remains, like an ember that still glows, reminding us that history is shaped not only by those who fight, but by those who build.